I don't want to set the world on fire.
Hi everyone, this is Violet Irwin. Thank you so much for tuning back into my channel today. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on in the UK, specifically about Tommy Robinson, but not necessarily in the way that other people have been talking about this issue. The facts of Tommy Robinson's case have been described in pretty good detail at this point. Other individuals like Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux and yada yada have really done a good job of making what's happening in UK clear and public and in the forefront. So I don't think I need to spend a lot of time refreshing memory on what happened there, but I do want to talk about what's happening in the UK and why something like what happened to Tommy Robinson could occur. And so that's what I'm going to do this video about today. Just to give you a quick Reader's Digest version. At some point over the last couple years, I don't remember exactly when, Tommy Robinson was filming outside of a courthouse wherein he was trying to, he was like filming the proceedings that were related to some of the rape gangs that have been happening in the UK. Now, because he was being a little bit, or allegedly being a little bit, feisty at the courthouse, they kind of gave him a suspended sentence at that time and said, like, please don't film on court property anymore, yada yada yada. And at that time they gave him a 3-month suspended sentence. So last week, whenever this all went down, I don't remember exactly the specific date, but when Tommy Robinson got arrested, what occurred was Tommy Robinson was outside of a courthouse, but he wasn't on court property anymore. He actually made sure, or this to my knowledge, he made sure that he was off of court property and was live streaming to Facebook or something like that about what was happening inside the courthouse. And then he was immediately arrested by like 4 different cops, man. I mean, so many cops just like swarmed on Tommy Robinson. And in less than 8 hours, 4 hours, or I've heard different reports, but very shortly thereafter was sentenced to 13 months in prison. And the Orwellian part of this was that, not that that's not Orwellian enough, that whole situation right there, but the really eerie part was that the judge in Tommy Robinson's case ordered that the media of the UK could not report on what had happened to Tommy Robinson. So all of these UK outlets had to like delete the articles that they had written about it and get rid of it or whatever. And so it was very much an attempt by the UK government to try to just wipe this off the map and have no one talk about it and just be able to send Tommy Robinson to prison without a big ruckus happening. Obviously the judge knows how many Islamists and other extremist radicals are in these prisons in the UK. It's a lot. So the judge knows that. The judge knows that Tommy Robinson, receives death threats from these kinds of people all the time, and then sending him to prison for this amount of time is tantamount to a death sentence for Tommy Robinson. So in the last 48 hours or so, at least from the filming of this video, the UK, because of all of the, negative reaction to these actions, has now said that reporters in the UK can report on Tommy Robinson's case. Because I'm sure, as viewers of my channel will know, there are videos online of, hundreds of people protesting on Tommy Robinson's behalf in various parts of the UK. And, clearly this judge didn't understand the Streisand effect, because even if the UK couldn't report on Tommy Robinson, everyone in the United States certainly did. And eventually, after a couple days' time, Tommy Robinson was the cover of the Drudge Report. And much to the mainstream media's chagrin, the Drudge Report is actually the most viewed media source outside of MSN News, which, let's be real, that's just because people use that email service and it pings whenever that email service is open. So MSN is the #1 news source in America that people use online, but Drudge is #2. So Tommy Robinson's face was the cover, or like the front page of the #2 news source in America for having this Orwellian kind of situation happen to him. Now, I know I was talking really fast through that, but I just wanted to give a quick overview for anyone who's been living under a rock and didn't know this was happening in the UK about what happened, but I'm not going to focus on that. I really want to talk about specifically how Islamization of the UK and political correct culture facilitated what happened to Tommy Robinson. All right, we all know it's crazy that he received that prison sentence. We all know it's pretty much a death sentence. We know that it's super Orwellian, straight out of 1984, for somebody to order a gag order like that on the media. But the real issue is, how could the UK have gotten to this place where behavior like this could actually happen with the police, and where this many police officers would feel comfortable arresting someone for filming, near a courthouse, or that a judge would feel comfortable issuing a gag order like that. So first, I want to talk about the Islamization, and I know that it's dangerous for me to put out commentary like this because, there's a lot of people who just don't want you talking about Islam or Sharia law, creeping Sharia at all. But I'm much more scared of what happens if we don't talk about this, so I'm going to talk about it. Okay, for a long time, I've been watching various YouTube videos about what's happening in Europe, and I posted a video on my channel called What I Learned Living in Germany, which has been certainly my most controversial video of anything that I posted. And all I did was literally discuss my observations, right? But in any event, for a long time, I personally tried to deny what was going on in Europe because it just breaks my heart. I've lived in Europe on 2 occasions, and I've traveled to Europe more than that. Like I've been to, outside of living in Rome and Germany, I have been to pretty much, I would say I've been to 80% of the countries in Western Europe. And I've been to France on multiple occasions, and I have been to the UK, I've been to London. And I've just been so alarmed about what's happening in London, and frankly, even myself, I've been in a bit of denial about what's happening in the UK because I really hope that I'm wrong. Like, I really hope that everyone who's talking about the Islamization of the UK, and these people who I've seen online who are like, oh my gosh, there's like an 85% chance that the UK is going to become an Islamic state. It's like, that kind of stuff scares the shit out of me. It really scares me. But the reason why I've started to come to believe that that's true is because of stuff like what happened to Tommy Robinson. And specifically, I just want to talk about some of the things that have been happening in the UK. So, and a simple Google search, I think, will be able to corroborate this. I do hate when people say that in videos, but just so you know, like, the stuff I'm about to tell you is not stuff that I just am fabricating from my head. To the extent that my numbers are inaccurate, it's just because of memory and the fact that I'm driving. The rise of acid attacks first in the UK has been very alarming to me. So I've seen some news articles in this regard that might show an individual's face who's been a victim of an acid attack, and I mean, it is not pretty. This is horrifying, gruesome stuff that people have acid thrown in their faces and are just disfigured for life, And acid attacks have been on an extreme rise in the UK. I'm not sure exactly off the top of my head what the numbers were, but it was something like they've increased like 3 or 4 times the number of acid attacks that occur. And, sometimes these acid attacks will happen to just like someone who could have been me, right? Like someone who's on vacation in the UK, or someone who's traveling there to study abroad or something, like a college student who's backpacking through Britain, just gets fucking like Drano and other chemicals thrown in their face and are just disfigured for life. And it's one thing to have that stuff occurring, but it's another thing to have the British government, first of all, barely pretend it's a problem. But to the extent that they even acknowledge that it's a problem, mostly what they talk about is like, well, how can we ban Drano, or how can we ban these chemicals? Because clearly the UK has not learned from their ban on guns and other things that banning certain materials doesn't necessarily mean that people can't have them or access them and or use them for ill. The acid attacks is just a good example of the UK, specifically the UK government, turning a blind eye to something that's clearly an epidemic happening in their towns, in their cities, and just allowing, individuals to get away with these horrific crimes, and just trying to, prohibit everyday people from using, household products like Drano. We care so much about not being quote-unquote racist against quote-unquote Muslims, even though Islam is not a race, it's a religion, that we are going to, restrict the access of everyday Brits regarding their chemicals to, declog a drain or something, instead of just admitting that the individuals who are committing these attacks are from a certain ideology and that they're trying to further a certain agenda in the UK. The other thing that's been very alarming to me in terms of Sharia stuff, that's been coming into my view in the UK, which has been very alarming, is like, I don't know, the increased amount of sexual assault. It's really hard for me to talk about like Rotherham and Telford and these rape gangs and stuff because it's just so horrifying. I mean, part of me wants to believe that no human could be capable of the kind of horrific acts that these men have been committing against these young girls across Europe and specifically in the UK for the purpose of this video. But, it's just the truth. This has been happening and we have to acknowledge it. Like, as painful as it is for me to think about it, we have to acknowledge that there are migrants coming into Europe that have malicious intent. It's not all migrants. It's not all refugees. And in fact, it's not even everyone who's Muslim. Because like I've talked about in a previous video on immigration, just because, and also the video on the Syrian war, just because someone's Muslim doesn't mean that they actually subscribe to all of the tenets of that faith. Just like most Christians don't actually abide by most of the stuff in Christianity. But there's a large enough percent of the Muslims who are coming in who do think that women who are walking around in public, specifically in the UK, without a hijab or whatever, are indecent. It's really a way of saying to these women, unless you abide by the Sharia version of how a woman's supposed to dress, how a woman is supposed to be modest, then it is fair game for us to rape you and brutalize you and whatever because you are an infidel. And like I said, a lot of Muslims do not ascribe to this belief, but the UK has imported enough of the ones that do, where they had these horrific, rape gang scandals that happened in Rotherham and Telford, where, thousands of girls have been sexually trafficked and abused and raped. And, just to give you an example, I was listening to this woman who was talking about one of the cases in the Rotherham rape gang scandal. And this girl said, this girl can't have been more than 15 years old. Probably younger, probably like 12. But this girl said that she had been raped by so many men that after she got to 36, she stopped counting how many different men had been inside her. 36 men. And the UK, instead of exposing this and trying to vilify the real boogeyman that is behind these insidious, gangs and gang rapes and, treatment of adolescent girls and, really children, like young girls, as objects and as property and as prostitutes and as whores and fucking, sluts or whatever, just because they're not Muslim. And the British government would rather let that occur, let that stuff be perpetuated throughout their society across all parts of the UK, than let one reporter fucking talk about it. Frankly, I'm not a government type, I'm not a politician or anything like that, but I gotta say that if I were, I certainly, because the thing is, to be a government politician type, you kind of have to be one of these people that's willing to do whatever you can to stay in power, right? And so, I'm not surprised, I am a libertarian, I don't trust the government at all. I am not surprised that the UK government, in order to save face and to stay in power, is not going to actually go after these rape gangs with the kind of ferocity that any kind of Western liberal society would. And the reason is because it's not good politics. And actually, it might be better politics than they think, because I bet the majority of the people who actually live in the United Kingdom are so sick of this bullshit, right? I bet it's like maybe 10-15% of the people who live in the UK that genuinely believe that all of this crap has nothing to do with Islam, and all of this stuff is just something that will eventually go away. Like, I think that's a very small minority of the British people. But that minority is so loud and stupid and angry that, the average Joe person living in the UK doesn't think they have any voice about this. So, for the average politician in the UK, they do not think that it is politically expedient to be going after these Muslim rape gangs. The thing is, if you allow yourself, or if as a government, right, you allow yourself to become so blind to reality, right, so very much out of touch with the British people and with what is legitimately happening to the individuals in your country, and not just these rape gangs, but like I talked about too with the acid attacks and stuff. Like, if you are not willing to admit there's a problem, number one, or once you're willing to admit that there's a problem, being able to acknowledge the cause of the problem or the source of the problem, then that problem will just never get solved. Don't forget, the British people ran an empire that controlled, enough of the world where the sun never set on it, right? Like, British people will revolt when they need to, okay? So, the British politicians, they're being very naive in the long term about how this is going to play out. But in the short term, these British politicians are like, look, if I come out and say this is really the product of like some Muslim rape gangs because part of their ideology is that women who don't dress conservatively or individuals who don't ascribe by Sharia law are infidels who need to be like treated appropriately, British politicians feel like if they acknowledge that, they're not going to be able to stay in office. The thing is, as fucked as I think America is culturally at the moment, the British are so much worse off. The British are so much worse off, because at least in America, we have this attitude of rugged individualism. Americans in general have this free speech thing that we're super vigilant about, but Brits aren't there. I mean, we fought a revolution so that we could ensure that we have the liberties that we do have, whereas the Brits had to stick with the results of, what happened under the king. Brits don't have that same fire within them regarding freedom of speech and all of this, where, they take to the internet and just get wild with memes and trolling and all of that to try to make sure that our speech stays free. The Brits are kind of more like, we don't really know about this American free speech thing. I mean, there's some Brits who love it and care about it, right? But it's not necessarily, it doesn't permeate their culture as much. I just think that in the long run, these politicians are going to be fucked because none of them want to live under Sharia law. And I think that they just have delusions of grandeur where they think that if they can, hide this under the rug for a certain amount of time, that they can kind of just pretend this problem doesn't exist, and eventually the Islamic extremist problem will go away. One thing that I thought was really fascinating, throughout the course of the election cycle and then the next year in 2017, was that it actually seemed like the UK was experiencing more terror attacks in their little isle than America was experiencing, like, all across our country, right? There's the bridge attack, Ariana Grande attack. It seems like the breaking point in Britain has been getting ever closer. I was very alarmed when I found out about how the #1 name in Britain for the last decade or so for new babies being born was Muhammad. People can name their child whatever they want, but you can't expect that if you replace all of the people in a culture, that the people who came in are all of a sudden going to adopt that previous culture. Why would they? So I know I've kind of gone on a rant about all of that, but the reason why I discuss all this stuff and the detail that I'm discussing it is just to illustrate that there has been a rise of Islamism in the UK, and it's partially a result of the migrant crisis. But even before the migrant crisis, the United Kingdom had been porting, you know, hundreds of thousands of individuals from the Middle East, from Africa, from wherever, you know, under the guise of creating this multicultural paradise. But it's just not, it's just a fallacy. It's just not true. Because if, as Douglas Murray says, I think, if you import the whole world, you import the whole world's problems. And so I think it's important for us, you know, in the United States, as we look at this unfold, to understand how this could happen, right? And so my first reason why Tommy Robinson could be jailed for just live streaming a YouTube video or live streaming a Facebook video outside of a courthouse in the UK is because the Islamization of the UK has gotten to a certain level of progression wherein Tommy's acts actually, I mean, because they are in violation of what Sharia law would like, right? I mean, he's reporting specifically on Muslims who committed some horrific acts, or at least allegedly committed some horrific acts, and is doing so bluntly. But, you know, he's talking negatively about the religion, and that's a big no-no under Sharia law, for those of you who are somewhat aware of how that works. The British government, in effect, is actually imposing Sharia law on Tommy Robinson, because they're saying that he was quote-unquote disturbing the peace just by doing something that would offend Muslims. Some people want to say, oh, he knew what he was getting into, but it's like, that's true only to the extent that you acknowledge that certain Muslim extremists would be outraged by the fact that he's just live streaming a Facebook video in front of a courthouse or near a courthouse. The mere fact that you say he knew what he was getting into means that you acknowledge that there is a real Islamic threat against Tommy Robinson for even attempting to report on this kind of stuff with any sort of clarity. But really, I'm very concerned about the state of Britain in terms of becoming a Sharia state, like an Islamic state. I heard some guy, like some military guy, about 6 months ago, make that claim that it's like 90% certain that that's going to happen. And I was so horrified by this that I spent so much time trying to research it to disprove what that guy said. But the more I research it, the more I fear the Islamic State that's coming to Britain. I have pictures from when I was in London, and I'm inside of the phone booth. You know, I saw Big Ben, I saw the Globe Theatre, I love Shakespeare. So it really breaks my heart to see this happening to Britain. But I really am scared that in a couple years' time, like, I might not be able to go to Britain. Not because, you know, of my passport in the US or anything I've done, but because I'm a Christian. And because it's an Islamic state, and just like Egypt, which I've always wanted to go to Egypt, you know, it's like, I can't go see the pyramids because something horrible could happen to me while I'm there. It sucks. Like, it legitimately sucks. So that's the kind of creeping Sharia part / Islamic State part that I think has really allowed this kind of thing to happen against Tommy Robinson. So I wanted to talk about that. So the second aspect of this is the political correct culture. For those of you who are followers of my channel and who watch me regularly, you'll probably know that I haven't actually addressed political correctness directly. I haven't made a video on it specifically, but I want to just talk about it, especially in terms of the UK. Because I feel like sometimes people don't understand how pervasive it is there, right? Because we have a political correctness issue in America, and if you say something out of line, your character might be assassinated, like your career will get nuked by the left or whatever. But in terms of like jail or anything like that, we actually have done a pretty good job in America of making sure that there's no criminal penalties for your speech. We're not perfect, but we're a lot better than some of these other countries. Anyone who's been following what's happening in the UK, specifically if you follow like Paul Joseph Watson or any of these other personalities, you'll know that the UK, instead of taking care of these acid attacks or these rape gangs and all this other stuff that I've been mentioning, these police in the UK have been focusing much more on cracking down on quote-unquote hate speech on the internet. So the gist here is that anything that's perceived as racist, sexist, And frankly, in keeping with what I also had been talking about just now, like Islamophobic, which isn't a real thing. I've never heard of someone being a Christianophobe or a Catholicophobe, but in any event, the UK government has been actively going online, tracking what people say, and then penalizing them if it's perceived to be quote-unquote hate speech. So Count Dankula, you know, he's in Scotland, he's not in Britain, but, you know, Count Dankula received a fine in a certain amount, I don't know off the top of my head, but he had to face a fine because he trained like a pug to do a Nazi salute in an attempt to make fun of the Nazis. And so the Scottish government was like, oh, like you're referencing the Nazis, like that's hate speech, even though the purpose of that was to mock the Nazis, right? So context doesn't matter. That's what the court said in the Count Dankula case. So context in this regard is irrelevant, which is just bonkers to me that any court in a Western culture could say something like that. But it's very obvious, you know, as you read more and more about the UK, that they're clamping down on the internet and all of that, but they don't really care about these Islamist types, right? And it's the same political culture that we've all faced. It's the same reason why Milo fucking fled the UK. It's the reason why, like, when Katie Hopkins speaks in the UK, people want to call her the biggest bitch in Europe. It's like, she's only telling the truth, man. Even if it's in a rough package, it's like, she's just telling the truth. Everyone wants to hate her. You know, it's weird because I really don't like Piers Morgan. Like, I don't respect him at all. But I appreciate to the extent that he calls out, like, these crazy leftists regarding this gender bending nonsense. Like, he doesn't like this idea of there being multiple genders. But even Piers Morgan is guilty of this political correctness thing. Because so recently we had this royal wedding, which I didn't care about at all, but because everyone on goddamn Twitter was talking about it, I was forced to know about it. So during this situation, Piers Morgan has previously talked about how Meghan Markle is a friend of his and how they've had these previous chats, and he writes this, like, quote-unquote open letter to Meghan Markle, and admittedly, he's actually telling her that she can't be preaching about social justice and equality from, you know, the princess bench, or so to speak, or the royalty bench. But I think it's notable that Piers Morgan thinks that he can tell the new Duchess of whatever what she's allowed to talk about. In Britain, maybe it's because of the idea of royalty where they have kind of this politeness culture, but it does seem like to me there's this idea of, like, you know, in Britain, like, we have our royalty, but they don't speak out of turn, you know? Like, if you're gonna be a Brit, you have to understand when to speak and when to shut your mouth. That is just so not my way of thinking. I am like a hardcore free speech absolutist American, right? And I am just not of this persuasion of, like, you have to speak a certain way. And even though I didn't vote for Donald Trump, it's one of the reasons why I liked Donald Trump, you know, in terms of the cultural battle, was because he doesn't give a shit what people think about what he says. And that's the American way. Like, I've got big problems with Trump in terms of, like, all of his drone strikes. And frankly, I just think that he's kind of a narcissist who flies by the seat of his pants. And so that's one of the bigger issues I have with him. But, you know, more power to him for saying what he thinks and sticking by it and never apologizing. I stand by that 100%. Roseanne Barr should have learned that lesson, but she didn't. Tommy Robinson talks about things that are certainly politically incorrect, right? And it's politically incorrect partially because of that whole Islamization of the UK thing, but also partially because, you know, he's just talking against the common narrative that's happening in the UK, which is that the UK is some kind of diverse paradise wherein guns are banned and everyone's safe and everyone cares about, like, feminism and equality and blah blah blah, and they were able to bring all of these migrants in and have no issues. But it's just not true. The inability to talk about stuff that matters is going to be the downfall of not just the UK, but of all of Europe. Because if you can't talk about the issues that are most pressing in your society, then you'll never be able to solve them. Europe has massive migration issues, right? even if there wasn't this like Muslim Islamic State aspect to that, there are huge migration issues in Europe just because there's so many people coming into the system who want welfare, and there's not that many people working to pay for it. But they can't talk about that. They can't talk about the migrant crisis, because if you talk about this flood of immigrants into Europe, you're anti-immigrant, you're anti-black somehow, or all this other crap. People for a long time have talked about immigration in a way where it's like, oh man, the immigrants built the United States. We're a nation of immigrants. It's like, fair enough as a classification in the US, unless you're a Native American or have Native American ancestry, kind of like I do, to a certain extent, it's hard to say that we're not a nation of immigrants, because almost everyone, came here from across the ocean. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and but for that, none of us would be here for the most part, right? But that's not the case in the UK. The UK is not a nation of immigrants. At least not until the last 100 years or so, where the immigrant population is now starting to like overwhelm the native population. But the people who live in the UK, right, and their ancestors are natives of that land. The British people who live in the UK and their ancestors who have been there for generation upon generation, they are not immigrants to the UK. They are the native peoples of that land. And so, for people in the UK to talk about how they're a nation of immigrants and anyone who talks about immigration negatively isn't PC, they're just off base, It's a little bit more complicated in America, but the UK, it's not. The UK is not a nation of immigrants. It's just not. And there's a lot of people who want to blame Britain for most of the world's ills, because of imperialism and yada yada. But the thing is, like, there's a lot of countries that didn't suffer from imperialism or had that whole thing happen that are still in tyrannical regimes, still in poverty, still fucked. And what has happened to the UK, right? I mean, the UK isn't the superpower that it once was. I mean, they're getting overrun by migrants and are going to end up in a situation where British women are going to have to wear a goddamn hijab whenever they go out in public to avoid getting raped. And I talked about this a little bit in my video regarding Germany as well, but the guilt, the cultural guilt of what happened with the Nazis is just so, pervasive in Europe. And I think that with the Brits, they have taken on this guilt of like, everything that happened because of colonialism or imperialism is now their fault, and they're just going to sacrifice themselves on this altar of political correctness because we can't be seen as racists ever again. Like, we'd rather destroy our peoples and our culture and just hand over our nation to Islamists. They'd rather say we're just inherently racist, fuck us, screw us, fuck our country, in proper masochist style, than realize that they're dealing with a real sadist who's gonna fuck them up. I really hope that there's still a fighting spirit in the British people that can come out of this and show the world that, they really care about Western values. But right now, I don't see it. Right now, I see a country that is lost. And I think that given that framework, it's easy to see why the kind of Orwellian court proceedings happen with Tommy Robinson. I mean, you've got a culture that is basically bowing down to Islam and simultaneously saying that we're not going to say anything that offends anyone ever because we don't want to be racist. And that combination is enough to fuck a culture. Societies are fragile. The network of people interacting with each other peacefully is a fragile structure. And you can tinker with it a little bit, but if you fuck with it too much, you destroy the whole thing. And it doesn't take that much to get there. And I really think the UK has surpassed that line by, embracing this Islamophobia nonsense. This whole, like, we gotta bow down to the Muslims, otherwise they're gonna kill us. To me, that means that you are already under Sharia law, and or you're at least underneath the thumb of these radical postmodernist leftists who think that they can control the language and bring about utopia as long as people never say the N-word or something. It's just nonsense. You can see how an Orwellian authoritarian state would evolve in that kind of environment. So, in closing, I just want to say that I really hope America can learn from what's happening in the UK and understand that Orwellian, crazy authoritarian situations, like what happened to Tommy Robinson, can only really manifest in the correct environment. And what the UK has done is create the perfect environment for that kind of Orwellian, authoritarian action to be taken. And what that means is that the UK has so prioritized Islamophobia and Sharia law, and so prioritized political correctness and postmodernism, that they have literally made their state an authoritarian place where people have no free speech and reporting on the truth is now a crime. But with that, I'm going to end this video. I want to thank all of you so much for taking the time to tune in and watch this video today. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe below. And hey, maybe consider donating to my Patreon. But for the time being, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.
I just want to start a flame in your heart.